This video will cover the French Revolution, France and Europe from 1789 to 1815. The major objectives are to learn the major events and figures of the French Revolution. Second, to understand the causes and consequences of the movement. And third, to analyze nationalism and its symbols. The French Revolution was a pivotal event in Western civilization. The French Revolution would start as really a movement of the Third Estate, the majority of the French population, the peasantry, against the First and Second Estates. The First Estate was comprised of the clergy, people that were taken from both the nobility and from the peasantry, but who held a rather special position in French society. France at this time was a Catholic country, and as such, the Catholic Church itself and its membership enjoyed a number of benefits, a number of privileges within society. The Second Estate was that of the nobility. The nobility had all the political power. Usually they were the ones as well with all the wealth. So within this system, you had the First and Second Estate with all of the privileges that society could offer. The nobility, for example, were oftentimes exempt from laws that came crashing down on the heads of the peasantry with quite a bit of ruthlessness. One example of this is the death penalty. The French nobility were basically guaranteed that should they ever be found guilty of a situation which required capital punishment, they would basically face execution in the form of, having one's head cut off, which was considered to be a very humane treatment of a prisoner. The peasantry, on the other hand, were still subject to torture. They were still subject to all forms of gruesome treatment in the course of an execution. Likewise, the nobility, for example, they themselves were not heavily taxed. The peasantry, on the other hand, they bore most of the financial burdens of the French state. So in the very beginning stages of the French Revolution, what happened was that the Third Estate, the peasantry, they were basically demanding rights. They were demanding treatment on par with that of the other two estates. So that was one of the main causes. And this is what really kind of brought the French Revolution into a position of such importance in Western civilization. It really was a moment in which all people became leveled within society. All people were to be treated equally under the law. So in terms of the causes, the states and privilege, that was forefront. And this had been like a long ongoing cause, something that had formed grievances for not a few years, not even a decade, but for well over 100 years. Now, in terms of kind of the more short-term causes of the French Revolution, the French people had been suffering from a series of poor harvests. And in addition to that, there was widespread unemployment. So there was that financial hardship as well as outright starvation. And across the sea, they had witnessed the American Revolutionary War bring about significant changes within the lives of the everyday person. And this inspired them to think about how they themselves could change their society. And this wasn't just limited to the peasantry either. There were members of the clergy and there were members of the nobility as well that looked to the American Revolution as a model of what the French nation could be. One of the best examples of this being the Marquis de Lafayette, who himself had served in the American Revolution and returned home, with many of the ideals that he had learned serving side by side with figures such as General George Washington. As stated a moment ago, the peasants were also heavily taxed. So adding to the problems with unemployment, adding to poor harvests, the lives of the average peasantry was not that great. So here we have an example, a picture of peasants surrounding a family table. And as you can see here, their clothes are the most basic that they can be provided, children going barefoot. There was not much in the way of a standard of living for them. In fact, many of the peasants, in fact, the majority of the peasants leading up to the French Revolution, survived mostly on a diet based on bread. Bread was essential to life for the majority of the French. Another major cause of the French Revolution was that of the Enlightenment. So just as the Enlightenment had spurred colonists in British North America to challenge the authority of Parliament as well as King George III, many of these enlightened ideas of sovereignty of the people, government reflecting the will of the people, all people being equal under the eyes of the law, all people being guaranteed with certain rights and having the ability to confront their government when they viewed it as tyrannical, these were very much alive in France, especially given the fact that we view France as really the cradle of the Enlightenment movement. And then there was the government itself. Keep in mind that the heart of the French government was still the Palace of Versailles, where King Louis XVI and his very young wife Marie Antoinette held court. If you wanted to advance your station in society as a noble, what you did is you took up residence at Versailles, and then you spent most of your time jockeying for positions of influence near the king and the queen. And most of this was done for your benefit and not necessarily for the benefit of the country at large. So while the government was very responsive to the demands and the desires of the nobility, when it came to the average French person, then it was a very unresponsive government. And leading this was, of course, the king and the queen. And these two monarchs, at such a critical time in French history, were really unequipped for the task. Louis XVI, for example, was known for really his hobbies in terms of doing things like, messing around with the mechanical workings of locks and clocks and other such devices. He was seen as very distant and uncaring when it came to the French people. And then you had Marie Antoinette, who really kind of reveled in the luxury that court offered. So here is a picture of Marie Antoinette in one of many of her renowned outfits. And you can see that, she was really known for her hairstyles that sometimes were beyond elaborate. So this one basically has feathers and flowers and all sorts of things, decorating this rather large hairstyle. In other famous portraits of her, she literally has a ship, like a naval vessel, decorating or adorning her hairstyle. Her gowns were lavish. She was known to hold parties and, basically like what we would equate to like a poker tournament at Versailles. And so while the people were out there starving, while they were in need, while they were groaning under the burdens of government and the lack of rights, here you had this symbol that became hated within French society of all the excesses of nobility and just the sheer inequality within society. So the beginnings of the French Revolution start with the calling of the Estates General. So the Estates General was a body that had existed within France, for hundreds of years, but it hadn't actually been called into session since the early 1600s under Louis XIV. And what the Estates General did is it brought together representatives of the nobility, representatives of the clergy, and then representatives of the Third Estate. Now, keep in mind that the representatives of the third estate were not individuals that were popularly elected. There was not really a system of voting. What you had instead were a series of courts known as parlements. And the Parlement basically served a twofold purpose. Number one, it provided government for the regions outside of the capital of Paris, and it also acted as a court of justice. Members of the third estate could be elected to it, though it was usually reserved for the nobility. And usually the way that a member of the third estate became a member of the Parlement was by purchasing an office that basically became hereditary. So keep in mind that representatives of the third estate, they're different than like what you would have seen in the British North American colonies, where there was at least some degree of voting. These tended to represent the middle and the wealthier peasants, which were a minority of that group within society. So when the Estates General met together in 1789, one of the first things that they did is they demanded an equal vote, or a vote that represented the population. So the way it worked traditionally in the Parlement, in the States General, is that the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate all had equal votes. So as a body, each one voted. And so the idea was first estate gets a vote, second estate gets a vote, third estate gets a vote. And this worked in the favor of the first and second estate because these tended to be the more traditional elements of society. The first estate oftentimes working to support the cherished privileges of the second estate. And what the third estate wanted to do is it said, no, we want to get rid of this. We want to get rid of this. We are the majority. And so what we want are votes that represent the population itself. This, of course, was pretty much decried by all members of the first and second estate. Only a few members went along with this, kind of what we would call today progressive individuals like Marquis de Lafayette. So after Louis XIV tried to prorogue the Estates General, the third estate almost en masse, as well as those few members of the first and second estate, they retired to what was called a tennis court. So don't think in terms of like, say, Serena and Venus Williams. Think more in terms of a handball court. And here they took the oath of the tennis court in which they swore that they would not dissolve their body until a constitution had been written that spelled out the rights of all people and a form of government that was based off of Enlightenment principles. So this is like the beginning of the process. So they're in here, they're working together. The Estates General is working to correct this, to create this a new system of government, and the people themselves become wrapped up in this. They overwhelmingly support the efforts of the third estate. And so they start taking to the streets, and right off the bat, there was this fear, this panic that starts to set in among the streets of Paris and other major cities. And this is known as the Great Fear, where they believe that Louis XIV is going to send in soldiers to break up everything that they're working for. And so the result was that this kind of mass movement occurs in Paris on July 14th, 1789, and they ended up storming the Bastille. The Bastille was, you could equate it to the Tower of London. It was a prison where anybody that dared to speak out against the government was taken. It was a place where members of the Third Estate were tortured, where they had no recourse to justice, no right to see a judge. And so it was a hated symbol of this absolute monarchy. So they stormed it, they killed the garrison, literally stuck the heads of the defending garrison on pikes and paraded them through the streets. And then they proceeded to tear it down brick by brick. And so it was a symbolic tearing down of the authority of their absolute monarch. Now, as this was happening, the Third Estate did manage to create a new document, a written constitution, and this becomes known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And it was agreed to and accepted on August 26th. And in this document, what they said was that, the government works or should work on behalf of the people, that it should represent the demands, the desires of the people. It also stated that all people should have the right to see a judge, that there should not be torture that is used against people, that certain rights are considered to be inalienable. So basically, it is a national declaration of natural liberties and a proclamation of the equality of all French men and women. And one of the important things to note about the French Revolution is that it actually does something that the American Revolution doesn't at the very beginning. It incorporated women. Women will become leading members of the French Revolution, and in the early years, they will make a series of gains in terms of their political rights. Now, from this, they began to develop other mechanisms to change this old system. One was a document passed called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. It was recognized that while the clergy were supposed to be independent, one thing that the French king enjoyed was the right to approve high-ranking members of the Catholic Church within France. And there was often this cooperation between the crown and between the church to continue these forms of control over the French people. So what the Civil Constitution of the Clergy did is it said, okay, from now on, all clergy members are to be elected, and they're going to be paid officials of the state. So their privileges were revoked. Furthermore, all church lands were to be confiscated. This was basically a form of land reform, where these vast holdings could then be sold to people who needed land to start family farms. And then there would be other limitations placed on different orders within the church. So basically, it's taking the church and moving them from this vaunted position in society down on par with all other people. Now, following that, they drafted and passed the Constitution of 1791, in which they created a unicameral legislative assembly. And deputies here were actually elected. They had to have specific property qualifications, but there was some form, the beginnings of popular suffrage or universal suffrage. They had term limits, and they were not privileged. They were called citizens. In fact, at this point, that became the common title that all people were granted: citizen, not lord, not peasant, citizen. The king himself became a paid official of the state. He could appoint ministers, but they couldn't sit in the assembly, and his powers were curtailed as well. And then they began, under this new government, to start changing the way local government was created and run. They started to create legal tribunals to replace those old parliaments with elected judges. The economy started to be modernized to meet the demands of this growing capitalist world system. And really, what they were doing here is they were ushering it in based on new modernized theories of government that were developed during the Enlightenment. Now, initially, Louis the XVI, supported or went along with these changes, although reluctantly, because he recognized that he was a hostage king. The countryside as a whole were going against him, as well as some of the leaders of the military. But after a while, he became uncomfortable and upset with many of these checks on his traditional power. So he made a fatal decision, and in June of 1791, he attempted to flee France to one of the neighboring monarchies surrounding the country, and his hopes were to remove himself, gain support, gain troops, and then go back in and basically crush this growing revolution. But he was caught in the French city of Varennes, and he was returned to Paris, and actually his entire palace was moved from Versailles to Paris, where he and his family had to live and had to work. Now, keep in mind that the monarchies of Europe at the time had a vested interest in making sure that no revolution in bordering states was successful, because it was a threat to their power. And more than that, they were also intermarried. So Marie Antoinette, for example, was actually the daughter of the powerful monarch of the Austrian Empire at this time. So another fateful event happens when it comes to the monarchy, and this was the Brunswick Manifesto of July 1792. With growing unrest in Paris, there was this fear that the royal family would be put to death. And so a leading noble issues this manifesto from Prussia, and he says, if anything happens to the royal family, we're going to invade and we're going to crush you, and we're going to absolutely wipe out this movement. And this whipped up the French people into an absolute frenzy. They view themselves now as under siege. They begin drafting soldiers into the army, preparing for war, preparing to march in preemptive assaults on their neighbors to keep their revolution alive. And in the process, the royal family, it becomes viewed no longer as, a monarch that they will keep, out of a sense of tradition and the government, a system of government that they were accustomed to. It changes. So Louis XVI himself is put on trial and basically accused of betraying the French people. And then he was beheaded in January of 1793. After that, Marie Antoinette was in prison. Her children were taken from her, and eventually she too was placed on trial. And this reviled individual was then accused of all sorts of slanderous crimes, including incest. She was accused of being a traitor, of leaking information, because at this point France was, in a state of war with Prussia and Austria and all of the surrounding countries. And she herself ended up following her husband to the guillotine. Her children themselves did not really survive captivity. And in the end, the French royal family was erased in the course of the early years of the French Revolution. So it was in this time period, going into in 1793, that the French Revolution, which began as an internal event, eventually moves towards an external revolution, one that they're going to start to export. So they begin fighting, and initially the fighting of France against surrounding countries was not very successful. I mean, they teetered on the verge of defeat at first. But then they began to rally, especially as a new breed of officers, including a young Napoleon Bonaparte, started to lead and started to transform the military into a very efficient and very effective fighting machine. So to counter this growing movement, a coalition was formed in spring of 1793 of surrounding monarchies against France. And this is what eventually will become the norm. They will go through multiple different coalitions. So what you'll see is periods of conflict and then truce, conflict and then truce, conflict and then truce, conflict and then truce. And as each of these truces are broken and the fighting recommences, what will basically happen is that different nations will come together in coalitions against the French. But the one power, the one belligerent nation that will always be involved in the fighting will be Great Britain. Now, as they fought the first coalition, the revolution quickly spirals out of control. The first major event to happen in this area were the September massacres that occurred from September 2nd to September 4th, 1793. You have armies marching against France and threatening to overrun the lines. And so what the people of Paris decided to do was that they went into all the prisoners where all these nobles were being held, and they just slaughtered them. Just absolute carnage. And then after that, the French people themselves begin to look for hidden enemies within their own ranks. It really starts with any nobles that were left, at large. Their actions become suspect. So, for example, the Marquis de Lafayette, as the Reign of Terror begins, he grows uncomfortable with what's happening, and he tries to get his family. He tried to get his family out of France, but was later imprisoned. And so it starts really with prominent figures of the Ancien Regime, as it was known, the old way, the old order. But after that, you have all these ad hoc people's courts that are set up. And anybody suspected of treason, anybody that doesn't dress the right way, anybody that expresses any reservations about the cause are found guilty. So, for example, during the French Revolution, it became very popular for people to begin dressing a new way, and they identified themselves through styles of dress. And they became known as the sans-culottes. Sans-culottes basically referred to the style of pants that people used to wear. So if you go back to the Enlightenment era, it was popular for men, and if you've ever seen a picture of the framers of the Constitution, you'll definitely see this, and excuse the rather poor drawing here. But the culotte, this was that old knee-length pair of pants that they wore throughout the 1700s. The sans-culotte, they basically did away with that because it was viewed as aristocratic. And so from this point on, men's pants went all the way down the leg. That's the beginning of this fashion. So simply doing something like wearing this form as opposed to the new form, that could mark you for death. And so these tribunals begin, and thousands of people end up finding themselves heading to what was known then as the guillotine. So the guillotine was this new invention that was supposed to be a new and more humane form of death. It was beheading people using this machine. And keep in mind, beheading was usually reserved for only the aristocracy. And so you had this big, huge, heavy blade that was hung up here, and with one pull of this cord, the blade came down and the head came off. And so here we have Louis XVI's beheading, and them showing the head to the crowd. So there was this public form of execution that just, put on display for everybody. This is what happens when you promote aristocracy over equality. Now, leading the Reign of Terror was a group of individuals known as the Committee of Public Safety. And it was a prominent group of what were known then as Jacobins. Jacobins were individuals in the early phases of the revolution and even predating that had come together in secret clubs that were illegal to debate Enlightenment ideas. And they consisted of prominent intellectuals and merchants of the Third Estate. So you had Maximilien Robespierre, a well-known intellectual of France. You had Georges Danton as well. These were prominent figures on the Committee of Public Safety. And they directed events within France during this time period. And as they were directing it, you had a newspaper editor by the name of Jean-Paul Marat, who's, he was a failed doctor, ended up basically sleeping in the sewers for a time. And he had this bile against anybody of privilege. And in his paper, he just let it rage. And so he would constantly denounce people in his paper. And he became a prominent voice, and his paper was known as Le Mythe du Peuple, which translated from French means friend of the people. So this populist voice that just really stirred up the masses. And what eventually happens is the revolution begins eating its own. Jean-Paul Marat was later assassinated by Charlotte Corday, who viewed him as, the cause of all the suffering. Georges Danton was later on condemned to the guillotine by none other than his best friend Maximilien Robespierre. And, he basically just says on, heading towards the guillotine that, his only hope was that, Robespierre would end up meeting the same fate. And well, guess what happens? Later on, Robespierre is accused of betraying the revolution, and he himself is taken to the guillotine after, in fact, he was actually wounded. He tried to shoot himself with a musket and ended up going through the side of his mouth. And so he was laid out, and they literally picked him up, took him semi-conscious to the guillotine and chopped off his head. So after this, what basically happens is leaders of the revolution say, okay, enough is enough. And they redirect the efforts and the energy of the revolution into what was known as the Directorate. And they created a new constitution, and the whole idea was, okay, there's a little too much democracy, a little bit too much craziness, so we're going to scale back some of the liberties of the people and their participation towards more level-headed individuals, and we'll basically direct affairs from here. Now, the Directorate wouldn't last long because of this young officer, an individual named Napoleon Bonaparte. And one of the things about Napoleon Bonaparte was that he understood really how to advance in life. I mean, this was a guy that came from Corsican nobility, but because he was Corsican, he was often looked down on by other nobles, and so he was limited in his military career. And he quickly made a name for himself. He was one of the officers that helped quell, some of the worst outbreaks of kind of mob rule in Paris and other cities. And then he led what was known as the Italian campaign in 1796 that defeated the various republics of Italy. And when he led this campaign, he was smart enough to bring along with him what you would call his own PR consultant, somebody that would write stories that praised his heroics from the battlefield. And he was actually a very capable officer. One of the things that he began to do in terms of changing up the military is he started to reorganize the military into different organizations where you would have elements of infantry that would be supported by artillery as well as cavalry units. And in these smaller, more agile units, you could march overland. You had more mobility, more flexibility. And so it was this type of structure that other kingdoms really didn't know how to engage against. And so his Italian campaign was swift, it was victorious, brought all this land into the empire. And this really kind of started his rise within government. He started to become a prominent voice, a prominent figure within the French government. Now, at the time that his star is rising, the French also became engaged in what was known as a quasi-war with the United States of America. Basically, what was happening was that both the British and the French, to harm each other, were targeting neutral merchant vessels that were trying to carry their cargo to British and French ports. And the United States was one of the largest neutral carriers of the time period. So there were a lot of, they ended up having, by the end of the French Revolution, almost as many merchant vessels being produced in New York and Boston alone as Great Britain did produce, which was rather significant. So the Adams administration at the time, what they tried to do is they tried to negotiate with both sides. Now the British were willing to make some at least superficial, overtures of peace with the Americans, but the French were not. In fact, the French viewed American attempts to establish an armistice with the British Navy as a betrayal of their support during the American Revolution. And so these two basically started outfitting privateers and attacking each other's ships on the high seas for 2 years. Now, the next major development that occurs as we get into the Napoleonic era was the granting of Napoleon with the title of First Consul. And so these are titles that really are going back to the time period of the Roman Republic. So before Julius Caesar, made his moves against the Roman Senate, you actually had leaders within the Senate that were known as consuls, and there would be anywhere from 1 to 2. And before his nephew Augustus Caesar assumed the throne, there were actually 3 of them. So by getting declared first consul, what this basically is doing is establishing him as almost like the president, if you will, political leader of France. Sorry, that's not 1899, that's 1799. So he is kind of leading France at this time. And he's viewing now continental conquest as the main objective, but he's also looking abroad as well. So his first overseas attempt to expand the French Empire was in Haiti. From 1802 to 1804, he attempted to reverse the movement that began with former freed African slaves led by Toussaint Louverture, who overthrew the white planter class. He sent to Haiti a force of about 30,000 soldiers, and the idea was first reestablish French control over Haiti, and then from there what they were planning on doing was reestablishing a North American empire within the territory of Louisiana, which was pretty much everything west of the Mississippi River. But yellow fever and just their inability to really tie down and have a decisive victory over Toussaint Louverture's forces led to frustration. And so Napoleon famously states, damn sugar, damn coffee, damn colonies, and that's when he authorized the sale of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and shortly thereafter pulled all of his troops out of Haiti. Now, the next major event was his coronation. So he gained so much popularity that he just basically ended up declaring himself emperor, the new emperor of the French Empire. And for many, this was a celebration, but for others, it was a betrayal. So Beethoven, for example, at the time was, a fierce Republican in Austria, and he was writing a symphony dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte. He was naming it L'Empereur, Emperor. And when Napoleon himself declared himself king, Beethoven scratched a. Sorry, he wasn't naming it L'Empereur. He was naming it, I think it was Napoleon. But anyhow, he scratches out the title of his symphony and named it after and replaced its name. So there was some controversy over this, especially abroad, although most French citizens tended to support his move. And then after he's coronated, after he's crowned emperor, he then rewrites the French laws into what was known as the Napoleonic Code. What the Napoleonic Code did is it pulled back on a lot of the gains that were made during the early days of the French Revolution. On the one hand, many of the gains were contained. So people were still considered citizen. You still had the right to trial by to see a judge, for example, and nobility's privileges were not restored to them. But at the same time, some of the other elements of the French Revolution were curtailed. So one of the biggest examples of this is within family. Paternal rights over the family were restored. And so once again, the father became the head of the household and could actually have children imprisoned if they didn't follow his will. Women's rights were curtailed, even though they themselves, during the earliest days of the revolution, were the ones that were storming the Palace of Versailles and building up barricades to protect against would-be invaders. But they ended up losing a lot of their rights. And in addition to that, he also, during his leadership, the church was somewhat restored. So instead of people trying to erase Catholicism from within France, the faith was restored and recognized as the leading faith within France, and the church got some of their original lands back. Now, as he was doing this, he again attempted to export the revolution overseas, and this time he turned his attention to Egypt and the Middle East. While he did manage some land victories during the campaign, ultimately it proved failure after Admiral Nelson led a naval victory against French forces at the Battle of Trafalgar. And this is significant because the Battle of Trafalgar basically ended any possibility that the French had of exporting their revolution abroad, much less invading England, because it was such an overwhelming defeat of the French Navy that they never again were able to really rival Great Britain on the high seas. So from that point on, most of the campaigns that the French army undertook were land campaigns. So from 1805 to 1807, he basically conquers the majority of the rest of Eastern Europe. He reorganizes the French Empire into the Grand Empire. And so that's this map right here, where you have in these green areas lands that were viewed as France proper. All of these light green areas were areas where Napoleon basically marched in and replaced the traditional monarchs with either his family members or with trusted confidants. And then everything that was in purple, these were allies. Basically, these people said, okay, we can't defeat Napoleon. We're just straight up not going to really resist him anymore. And we'll work with him so that we're not conquered. So the only kingdoms that really are left is Portugal, Great Britain, Sweden, and Russia to continue resistance. But lacking support of much of continental Europe, their taste for conflict really kind of wanes for a while. So from 1807 to 1814, much of Napoleon's interests are in Spain. Here he fought a conflict, especially against Spanish guerrilla fighters, trying to shore up a monarchy that he had reestablished under one of his relatives. And this is where General Wellington, by the way, really kind of got, kind of got his feet wet in fighting Napoleon and learning the techniques of Napoleon and his subordinates. He was here in the Peninsula campaign, so it would end up serving him very well. Now, this is really where Napoleon's at his height, because in 1812, two events occur. One event is really kind of minor for Europe. It's the War of 1812 with the U.S. versus Great Britain. But basically the United States of America, hoping that, Napoleon would continue to keep Great Britain bogged down, attempted to invade Canada as kind of revenge, if you will, for British impressment of troops and supplying Native Americans with weapons. But the Americans didn't have a crystal ball, and they could not see what would happen in 1812, and that was the Russian campaign. So Napoleon waited too long to invade Russia, and the result was that he got bogged down in the heart of the populated part of Russia in winter. They seized Moscow, but before he had actually arrived in Moscow, the Tsar had evacuated it and adopted what was known as a scorched earth campaign. All the buildings were put to the torch, and any food and material that could not be moved by the military, that was torched as well. And so the French army, with all of these troops from their client states and some of their allies, were stranded here. And they began to march back to Eastern Europe in hopes of escaping this bitter Russian winter. But what ends up happening is Napoleon basically abandoned his troops. He took maybe a few thousand troops with him and headed west as quickly as he could. And by the time the army emerged, about 30,000 troops and fighting spirits were what were really left of this great army. And so after that, it was the beginning of the end of Napoleon. The client states started to revolt in 1838. This would eventually start to involve the satellite states falling or betraying Napoleon. And it hit its apex in the Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of the Nations in October 1813, which was the first real defeat of Napoleon. And so after Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Leipzig, the French sued for peace. And one of the conditions was that Napoleon had to go. And so he was exiled to Elba Island in April of 1814. But not wanting to stay in his rather lavish exile, I mean, he was pretty well taken care of, he decided, he wanted to return to France. He believed that there was enough support for him and that there was still enough strength left in the French army that he could revive his great empire. And what resulted was the 100 Days' War, where Napoleon, experienced some early resounding defeat, and there were some French that, were believing that, hey, we can reverse the course of these events. But all of this came to naught with Waterloo. And this is where General Wellington, Lord Wellington, managed to outmaneuver and outfight Napoleon. And this was the final blow. Napoleon in France, their energy was spent, their strength was spent after this. Napoleon was sent to exile in St. Helena, where he died. off the coast of Africa. And following that, it was just a matter of, restoring peace. And so that's what the Council of Vienna did from 1814 to 15. And one of the things here that happened at Vienna was that, first of all, the French monarchy was restored under Louis the 18th. And so they actually had to do a little bit of shopping here to find a relative close enough to Louis the 16th to put on the throne. But another thing that happened in Europe was that liberalism was recognized as not going away. It was there to stay. So constitutional governance, rights of people, the right of the peasantry to vote, all of these ideas became enshrined. Now, for the next 50 or so years, the Council of Vienna would also produce what was known as the Concert of Europe, and then you also had what was known as the Holy Alliance, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and they tried to keep liberalism as contained as possible and to prop up the church and all these old, traces of what was left of the Ancien regime. But ultimately, by the conclusion of the 19th century, even this would come collapsing down. And so what resulted from this was a change to Europe. So if we look on the left-hand side of the map, what we have in this one is what Europe used to be like. You had the Holy Roman Empire, which was a number actually of different principalities that came together and elected an emperor to kind of represent them. You had empires that consisted of multiple ethnicities that could be both part of the Holy Roman Empire but also outside of its traditional borders. And following the French Revolution, what Europe was left with was instead these new entities that were increasingly becoming known as nation states. Based on this really kind of new concept that had, it had been in its nascent forms really since the medieval ages in some areas, but it really hadn't taken full hold yet, known as nationalism. Nationalism revolves around a nation, and these are people that share a common language, and this is crucial, common language. They have a common history. Usually they are of a common ethnicity. And this is what links them together, as well as having a traditional homeland. So an example today of true nations would be like the Kurds, although they themselves are not a nation state. You can look, for example, to say, the Danes are a good example of them being, of a specific, ethnic group, language, homeland, history, etc. So this is the desire to create this strong bond. And this idea of creating bonds based on this becomes known as nationalism. But here's the catch, is that most countries themselves, and even today, are not true nations in their sense. So many, such as Great Britain, actually is comprised of the Welsh, the Britons, the Scots, and portions of Ireland. Russia has all sorts of different ethnic groups. Even France itself, does have differences in terms, although much more minor. I mean, they're much closer to what you would consider to be a nation than these others, but even they do have some differences internally. So instead, what they start to do is they start to create communities that are imagined. And this is a term that was coined by Benedict Anderson, imagined communities. And so where these connections do not really naturally exist, they will try to create it by using, say, schools to make, say, French or Russian or, German, Austrian the official state language, by teaching a specific type of history and promoting a certain type of history, by identifying with national borders. And this was something that had to be worked on. And so going into the 1800s, this is really where these scenes are gonna what are being shown right here are gonna become so crucial. So, for example, the national holiday where you have parades and festivals, where these countries will bring out imagery and banners and flags. You'll have military members of the military there right next to citizens, parades that include national flags, statues made to represent, for example, liberty, posted throughout the country, the state flag, the country's flag being flown over all these different, public buildings. In the arts, the patronage of artists to depict key figures. So here is the death of Marat, Jean-Paul Marat, right here. And this became a famous image. And so, here's the wound that Charlotte Corday left with the knife while he's printing a page of L'Hymne du Peuple in his bath that he has to stay in because the skin disease that he acquired was so painful. This kind of almost Christ-like imagery of him as a martyr became a national image. And it's not just simply left at that as well. It's even the way that people displayed it personally. So, as stated earlier, the sans-culotte, just wearing the sans-culotte, was an act of patriotism. Brocades on the hat or pins displaying one's patronage as well. Making sure that your style that you wore in public was expressive of your connection to not only the French state, but also the French people. And you can even see this today. So one of the instances that I oftentimes think of is what happened in the 2008 election when Senator Barack Obama was running for office. And this was after 9/11 had happened. The United States was still deeply involved in Afghanistan and Iraq and hunting down Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And on the campaign trail, Barack Obama made this faux pas in which he forgot his lapel pin, his American flag lapel pin, and it caused a lot of criticism against him and a little bit of outrage against his detractors. So even today, even in modern society in the United States, arguments over what language you're going to teach in class, arguments over what type of history you're going to teach in class, arguments over whether or not burning the flag is considered an acceptable form of protest. All of these are those expressions and those continued debates in the creation of these imagined communities. And they all, within Western civilization, link back to the French Revolution. So the French Revolution, crucial. The result of it was the development of this new sense of nationalism, trying to create nation states, these imagined communities, which could even be seen in the United States of America as this young country also began to promote artists to carve busts of George Washington to be displayed in the halls of Congress, as they promoted the publications of American English dictionaries. There was the spread of constitutionalism and liberalism. European borders were redrawn, and they would not be redrawn on such a scale again until really World War One. And then, of course, there was the realignment of the European balance of power. And at this time in world history, this was the continent with the major powers that were projecting their power abroad. So any of these, this realignment was felt as far away as Africa, Asia, and the fledgling United States of America.